The Galactic Academy of Xenobiology stood as the largest learning center in the known universe, and students from over 200 different species came here to study the mysteries of life across the stars. And today was a special day because Professor Thelix was about to give his famous lecture on predator species. Professor Thelix was an insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see in 12 different spectrums of light, and he had been teaching at the Academy for over 60 years, and his predator species seminar was legendary among students because it was designed to terrify them into respecting the dangers of the galaxy. The auditorium was massive and could hold over 300 students at once. And today, every seat was filled with young aliens from dozens of peaceful civilizations, and most of these species had evolved on calm worlds with gentle climates and abundant food, and they had never needed to develop the instincts of hunters or fighters. There were the Villani, who looked like tall, graceful birds with feathers of blue and silver, and they came from a world of endless skies, where they never had to worry about ground predators. And there were the Thracic, who resembled large amphibians with smooth green skin and bulging eyes, and their homeworld was covered in warm, shallow seas, filled with plants they could eat. There were the crystallines, who were beings made of living mineral, and they grew slowly over centuries, and had no natural enemies, because nothing could digest their rocky bodies. And there were dozens of other species too, and all of them shared one thing in common, and that was that they came from worlds where survival was easy. But sitting in the back corner of the auditorium was someone different, and his name was Kevin Park, and he was a human, and he was the only human at the entire Academy. Kevin was 22 years old, with black hair and brown eyes, and a build that was neither particularly large nor particularly impressive by galactic standards, and he sat quietly in his seat and watched as his classmates whispered and pointed at him when they thought he was not looking. Other students avoided Kevin, and not because he had done anything wrong, but because of what he was. And humans came from Earth, and Earth was classified as a Class 7 death world, and that meant it was one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy. The other students had heard stories about Earth, and they knew it was a world of extreme temperatures and violent weather and deadly diseases and toxic plants and venomous animals and massive predators. And the fact that humans had not only survived on such a world, but had thrived and built a civilization was something that made other species very nervous. Kevin noticed their stares, but he did not react, and he was used to it by now, and he had been at the Academy for 6 months, and in that time he had learned that most aliens were afraid of humans, even though they tried to hide it, and he understood why, but it still made him feel lonely sometimes. Professor Thelix clicked his mandibles to get the attention of the class, and the auditorium fell silent as the insectoid professor activated the holographic display at the front of the room. Today, we will learn about fear, the professor said in his clicking, rasping voice, and we will learn why some species should never be approached under any circumstances, and we will learn this lesson through direct observation. The students shifted nervously in their seats because they knew what was coming, and the ball predator species seminar always included a live demonstration, and that demonstration always involved something terrifying. Professor Thelix pressed a button, and the wall behind him slid open to reveal a massive reinforced chamber with transparent walls, and inside the chamber was a maze of corridors and rooms, and the whole thing was bathed in dim red light. And in the center of the maze was the creature. Several students screamed when they saw it, and others covered their eyes, and a few of the more sensitive species actually fainted in their seats. But Kevin just leaned forward slightly and studied the thing with curious eyes. It was called a Void Stalker, and it was one of the most feared predators in the galaxy. And it stood about 3 meters tall, with 8 long limbs that ended in curved claws, and its body was covered in black chitinous armor that seemed to absorb light, and its head had no visible mouth, but it had 6 eyes that glowed with a pale, sickly yellow color. The Void Stalker did not hunt with speed or strength, although it had plenty of both, and instead it hunted with fear, and it could sense the terror of other creatures, and that terror drew it like blood in the water draws a shark, and once it locked onto a frightened prey, it would stalk that prey for days or weeks or even months, and it would never stop until its victim collapsed. From exhaustion and horror, this specimen was captured 3 years ago, Professor Thelix explained, and it has been studied extensively, and we have learned much about its hunting methods, and today you will observe how it tracks prey through psychological warfare. Professor activated another control, and suddenly holographic figures appeared in the maze, and these figures were designed to simulate frightened prey animals, and they moved through the corridors with jerky, panicked motions, and they emitted signals that mimicked the biological signs of fear. The Void Stalker immediately began to move, and it flowed through the maze like liquid shadow, and its movements were completely silent, and its 6 eyes tracked the holographic prey with terrible focus, and the students watched in horrified fascination as the creature demonstrated its hunting techniques. Does not simply chase, the professor explained, and it positions itself, and it waits, and it lets the fear build, and it understands that terror is a weapon, and it uses that weapon with surgical precision. Kevin watched the creature carefully, and he noticed something that the other students did not seem to see, and the Void Stalker was not just hunting the holograms, and it was also watching the observation window, and every few seconds its 6 yellow eyes would flick toward the auditorium, where 300 very real and very frightened students sat watching. Kevin frowned and he raised his hand, but Professor Thelix did not notice because he was too focused on his lecture, and Kevin lowered his hand and continued watching, and he saw the Void Stalker pause near the edge of the maze, closest to the observation window, and he saw it press one clawed limb against the barrier, and he saw the barrier flicker. Something is wrong, Kevin said, but his voice was lost in the noise of 300 students gasping and whimpering at the display, and then the lights went out. The auditorium plunged into darkness, and for a moment there was complete silence, and then the screaming started, and Kevin heard the sound of something large moving through metal ducts above their heads, and he heard Professor Thelix shouting for calm, but the professor's voice was shaking with fear. The emergency lights came on, and they bathed everything in dim red, and Kevin looked up at the observation window, and he saw that the maze chamber was empty, and the Void Stalker was gone. It has breached containment, someone screamed, and the word spread through the auditorium like fire, and suddenly 300 students were trying to reach the exits all at once, but the doors had automatically sealed when the breach was detected, and they were trapped. Kevin stood slowly, and he looked around at the chaos, and he felt something strange happening inside his chest, and it was not fear exactly, although there was some fear mixed in, and it was something older and deeper, and it was something that his ancestors had felt 1,000,000 years ago on the plains of Africa when they heard a lion roar in the darkness. It was the feeling of a predator recognizing another predator. Kevin took a deep breath, and he pushed his way through the panicking crowd toward the security terminal at the front of the auditorium, and he had no idea if he could do anything useful, but he knew one thing for certain, and that was that running and screaming would not save anyone. The hunt had begun. The auditorium had become a scene of complete chaos, and 300 students from dozens of different species were pushing and shoving and climbing over each other in their desperate attempts to reach the sealed doors, and the air was filled with screams and clicks and whistles and every other sound that terrified aliens could make. Kevin pushed his way through the crowd, and he moved with purpose, while everyone else moved with panic, and he reached the security terminal at the front of the auditorium, and he began studying the controls, and they were designed for species with 4 arms, but he figured out the basics quickly enough. Professor Thelix was lying on the floor nearby, and the insectoid professor had gone into stress-induced molting, which was something his species did when they experienced extreme fear, and his exoskeleton was cracking and peeling, and he was completely helpless, and Kevin knew he would get no help from that direction. The security terminal showed a map of the building, and Kevin could see red warning lights flashing everywhere, and he could see that the Void Stalker had entered the ventilation system, and it was moving through the ducts above their heads, and it was circling the auditorium like a shark circling a boat full of bleeding swimmers. Kevin heard a sound behind him, and he turned to see a young alien approaching, and she was a Villani, which meant she looked like a tall, elegant bird with feathers of pale blue, and her name was Emily Davis, and Kevin had spoken to her a few times in class, and she was one of the few students who did not seem completely terrified of him. "What are you doing?" she asked, and her voice was shaking, but she was not running and screaming like everyone else, and Kevin respected that. "I am trying to figure out how to survive this," Kevin said, and he turned back to the terminal, and he pulled up more information about the building and its systems. Emily moved closer, and she watched him work. And after a moment, she spoke again, and she said, "You do not seem afraid." Kevin considered the question, and he realized that she was right, and he was not afraid, and that was strange, because he should be afraid. And there was a deadly alien predator loose in the building, and it was designed by evolution to hunt and kill creatures exactly like him. "I am afraid," Kevin admitted, but fear does not help right now, and so I'm putting it aside, and I'm focusing on the problem." Emily stared at him with her large golden eyes, and she did not seem to understand what he meant. And Kevin realized that for her species, fear was not something you could put aside, and fear was an overwhelming force that shut down all rational thought, and that was why her people had never developed the instincts of hunters. A new voice spoke up, and it was deeper and more skeptical, and Kevin turned to see a Thracic approaching, and he was a large amphibian with mottled green skin, and his name was David Kim. And he was one of the students who had been most vocal about his distrust of humans. "What exactly do you think you can do?" the Thracic asked, and his tone made it clear that he did not expect Kevin to have a real answer. Kevin did not respond immediately, and instead he pulled up more data on the terminal, and he found what he was looking for, and it was the environmental control system for the building, and he studied it for a moment, and then he began to smile. David stepped back when he saw that smile, and there was something in it that made him deeply uncomfortable, and it was not a happy smile, and it was not a friendly smile, and it was the smile of something that had just figured out how to win a fight back home. Kevin said, "And we have a saying, and the saying is this, and when you cannot run from something, you make it run from you." David made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it came out more like a croak, and he said, "Nothing makes a Void Stalker run, and they are apex predators, and they have no natural enemies, and they do not know fear." Kevin turned to face the Thracic, and he looked him directly in his bulging amphibian eyes, and he said, "They have never met a human before." The screaming in the auditorium was starting to die down, and not because people were calming down, but because they were exhausting themselves, and many students had collapsed from the stress, and others were huddled in corners and shaking, and a few were still pounding on the sealed doors, but most had given up. Kevin raised his voice, and he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, and he said, "Listen to me." The auditorium fell silent, and 300 pairs of alien eyes turned to look at the human, and most of those eyes were filled with terror, and some were filled with suspicion, and a few were filled with desperate hope. "The doors are sealed," Kevin said, "and campus security is 7 minutes away, and the Void Stalker is in the ventilation system directly above us, and it is waiting." A crystalline student named Brian Lee spoke up, and his voice sounded like stones grinding together, and he asked, waiting for what Kevin pointed upward, and he said, "It is waiting for us to separate, and it is waiting for someone to try to run, and it hunts by fear, and right now, this room is filled with so much fear that it cannot focus on any single target. And so it is waiting for the fear to concentrate." Emily understood first, and she said, "So, if someone runs alone, then it will have a target." Kevin finished, "and then it will hunt." David crossed his arms, and he said, "So we stay here, and we wait for security, and we do not move. Kevin shook his head, and he said no, and that will not work either, and the creature is smart, and it has been learning during its captivity, and it will find a way into this room eventually, and when it does, we will all be trapped with no way out then. What do you suggest? The Throssic demanded. Kevin turned back to the terminal, and he pulled up a schematic of the ventilation system, and he said, we do not wait for it to come to us, and we go to it and we hunt it. The silence that followed was absolute, and every alien in the room stared at the human, as if he had just suggested they fly into a star, and the idea of hunting a void stalker was so absurd that none of them could even process it. You are insane, Emily whispered. Kevin nodded, and he said, probably, and Bud, I am also the only one here who comes from a world where things like this are normal, and on Earth we have creatures that hunt us, and we learned a long time ago that the only way to survive is to become the thing that hunts them back. He began typing commands into the terminal, and he said, I need volunteers, and I need people who can do specific things. And Emily, you have the best hearing of anyone here, and I need you to track the creature's movement through the vents, and David, your species can produce bioluminescence, and I need you to create distractions, and Brian, your body secretes mineral compounds, and I need you to seal corridors behind us. The three aliens looked at each other, and they looked at the human, and they looked at the ceiling where they could hear something large moving through the ducts, and they made their decisions. What will you do? Emily asked. Kevin smiled again, and it was that same unsettling smile, and he said, I will be the bait. Hunt was about to begin, and for the first time in its existence, the Void Stalker was going to learn what it felt like to be prey. Kevin stood in the biology lab, adjacent to the main auditorium, and he was searching through cabinets and drawers, while Emily and David and Brian watched him with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror, and he was looking for very specific things, and he was finding them. What are you doing? David asked, and his amphibian voice was thick with doubt and fear. Kevin held up a vial of amber liquid, and he said, this is a pheromone compound, and it mimics the scent of wounded prey, and I'm going to cover myself in it. Emily made a sound of distress, and her blue feathers ruffled with agitation, and she said, that will draw the creature directly to you, and that is suicide. Kevin shook his head, and he said no, and it is strategy, and let me explain. Something about humans and about how we survived on our death world. Began applying the compound to his skin, and the smell was sharp and metallic, and it made the other aliens back away instinctively, and Kevin continued talking as he worked. Humans are not the fastest animals on Earth, he said, and we are not the strongest, and we do not have claws or fangs or venom, and we do not have armor or shells, and by every measure we should have been eaten into extinction millions of years ago. Then how did you survive? Brian asked, and his crystalline body caught the dim emergency lighting and scattered it into rainbow patterns. Kevin finished applying the compound, and he looked at the three aliens, and he said, we survived because we learned three things that no other species on our world ever learned. He held up one finger, and he said, first, we learn pursuit predation, and that means we do not chase our prey to catch it, and we chase our prey until it collapses from exhaustion. And humans can run for hours and days and weeks, and we never stop, and eventually everything else gets tired and falls down, and then we kill it. The aliens exchanged glances, and this was not something they had ever heard before, and the idea of chasing something until it simply gave up was alien to their understanding of how predators work. Kevin held up a second finger, and he said, second, we learned pattern recognition, and that means we can watch something and predict what it will do next, and we can see a pattern where other creatures see only chaos, and that lets us set traps and ambushes. And we can be waiting exactly where our prey will go before it even knows it is going there. David shifted uncomfortably, and he was beginning to understand why other species were so nervous around humans, and he was beginning to think that nervousness was completely justified. Kevin held up a third finger, and he said, third and most Importantly, we learned spite, and spite means we will accept damage to ourselves in order to defeat an enemy, and we will let ourselves get hurt if it means we can hurt something else more, and we will die if it means our enemy dies with us. And this is something that no other species in the galaxy seems to understand. Emily spoke quietly, and she said that is terrifying. Kevin smiled, and he said yes, and that is exactly the point. He walked to the door of the biology lab, and he looked out into the darkened corridor, and he could hear the Void Stalker moving through the vent somewhere above, and he turned back to his three reluctant allies. Here's the plan, he said, and Emily, you will stay in contact with me through this communicator. And he handed her a small device, and you will track the creature's movement by sound, and you will tell me where it is at all times. Emily took the device, and her feathered hands were trembling, but she nodded. David, you will move through the maintenance corridors on the lower level, and you will use your bioluminescence to create flashes of light in different locations, and this will confuse the creature and make it think there are multiple targets. David did not look happy, but he also nodded, and Kevin could see that the thoracic was starting to believe that this might actually work. Brian, you will follow behind me at a distance, and you will use your mineral secretions to seal every corridor after I pass through it, and this will limit the creature's options and force it to go where I want it to go. Brian rumbled in agreement, and his crystalline body shifted and clicked as he prepared himself for the task. Kevin took a deep breath, and he said the goal is to drive the creature toward the cargo bay at the far end of the building, and the cargo bay has environmental controls that are separate from the rest of the facility, and I have already programmed those controls to reduce the oxygen levels when I give the signal. You are going to suffocate it, Emily said, and understanding dawned in her golden eyes. Kevin nodded, and he said, Void Stalkers need high oxygen environments to function at full capacity, and if I can get it into the cargo bay and seal it inside and reduce the oxygen, it will slow down and eventually lose consciousness, and then we win. And what happens if it catches you before you reach the cargo bay? David asked him, and was silent for a moment, and then he said, then you seal the corridor with me inside, and you wait for security to arrive. The three aliens stared at him, and none of them spoke, and Kevin did not wait for them to find words, and he stepped out into the darkened corridor, and he began to whistle. The sound echoed through the empty hallways, and it was a simple tune that Kevin had learned as a child, and it was completely out of place in this situation, and that was exactly why he was doing it. And the Void Stalker had never encountered prey that made noise on purpose, and it had never encountered prey that wanted to be found. Kevin walked slowly down the corridor, and he let the pheromone compound do its work, and he felt his heart beating fast in his chest. But he did not let the fear show on his face, and he kept whistling, and he kept walking. Emily's voice came through the communicator, and she said, it is moving, and it is coming toward you, and it is in the vent directly above the corridor you are in. Kevin did not speed up, and he did not slow down, and he kept the same steady pace, and he said, good, and tell me when it drops. He heard a sound above him, and it was the sound of metal bending, and he knew the creature was close, and he could feel something watching him, and every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run. But he did not run, and he kept walking, and he kept whistling. It is directly above you, Emily said, and her voice was tight with fear, and I think it is going to the ceiling. Exploded. Kevin dove forward, and he felt something sharp rake across his back, and he hit the ground and rolled, and he came up running, and behind him he heard the Void Stalker land in the corridor with a sound like thunder. He did not look back, and he ran, and the hunt had truly begun. Kevin ran through the darkened corridors, and behind him he could hear the Void Stalker following, and its 8 limbs clicked against the metal floor in a rhythm that sounded like death approaching, and Kevin did not look back because looking back would slow him down, and slowing down would kill him. His back burned where the creature's claws had torn through his shirt and into his skin, and he could feel blood running down his spine, but he ignored it, and pain was just information, and right. Now that information was telling him he was still alive. Emily's voice crackled through the communicator and she said, "Turn left at the next junction and David is creating a light distraction in the right corridor, and it might buy you a few seconds, Kevin." Turned left, and behind him, he heard the Void Stalker pause, and he heard it make a sound that might have been confusion, and then he heard it turn right toward the flashing lights that David was creating. Good. Kevin gasped into the communicator, and Brian sealed the right corridor now. He heard a grinding sound behind him, and he knew that Brian was doing his job, and the crystalline aliens' mineral secretions were hardening into a wall that would block the creature for at least a few minutes. Kevin slowed to a jog, and he needed to catch his breath, and he needed to think. And he looked at the map on his communicator, and he saw that he was about halfway to the cargo bay, and he also saw that there were 3 more junctions between him and his destination. "How long until it breaks through the seal?" Kevin asked Brian. Voice came through, and it sounded like gravel in a tumbler, and he said maybe 2 minutes and maybe less, and it is very strong. Kevin started running again, and he said, "Emily, keep tracking it and tell me exactly when it breaks through." The next few minutes were a blur of corridors and junctions, and Kevin used every trick he could think of to stay ahead of the creature, and David created distractions with his bioluminescence, and Brian sealed corridors behind them, and Emily guided Kevin through the maze of hallways with her incredible hearing. But the Void Stalker was fast, and it was smart, and it was learning their patterns, and each time they tried a trick, it worked a little less well than the time before it broke through another seal. Emily reported, and it is adapting, and it is not falling for the light distractions anymore. And Kevin, it is getting closer. Kevin checked the map, and he saw that he was 1 junction away from the cargo bay, and he also saw that the Void Stalker was right behind him, and there was no time for another distraction and no time for another seal. He burst into the central atrium, and this was a large open space where several corridors met, and it was the last room before the cargo bay, and Kevin stopped in the center of the atrium, and he turned around and he waited. Void Stalker emerged from the corridor behind him, and it moved slowly now, and it seemed to understand that its prey had stopped running, and it was savoring the moment, and its 6 yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, and its black armored body seemed to absorb the dim emergency lighting. Kevin stood his ground, and he watched the creature approach, and his heart was pounding, and his back was screaming with pain, and his lungs were burning from running, and he smiled. The Void Stalker stopped it, had been hunting intelligent prey for thousands of years, and in all that time, it had never seen anything smiling. And smiling was what predators did, and prey did not smile, and prey ran and screamed and begged and died, but they did not smile. Kevin spoke, and his voice was calm and steady, and he said, "You are very good at what you do, and I want you to know that I respect that, and you are a perfect killing machine, and you have terrorized countless species across the galaxy, and you have never failed to catch your prey." The Void Stalker tilted its head, and it did not understand the sounds the human was making, but it understood that something was wrong, and this was not how prey was supposed to behave. But here is the thing. Kevin continued, "And you have never hunted a human before, and we come from a world that makes your world look like a paradise. And we evolved alongside creatures just as deadly as you, and we did not survive by being faster or stronger, and we survived by being smarter and meaner and more stubborn than anything else on our planet." He took a step forward, and the Void Stalker actually took a step back, and this had never happened before, and prey did not advance, and prey did not approach. "I have been leading you," Kevin said, "in every corridor and every junction, and every turn has been my choice and not yours. And you thought you were hunting me, but I was hurting you, and you are exactly where I want you to be." The creature made a sound that was almost like a growl, and it lunged forward, and Kevin moved. He was not fast enough, and he knew he would not be fast enough, and the creature's claw caught his shoulder and tore through muscle, and Kevin screamed, but he did not fall, and he grabbed the creature's limb with both hands, and he held. On the Void Stalker tried to pull back, but Kevin would not let go, and he looked up into its 6 yellow eyes, and he laughed, and the laugh was wild and primal, and it was the laugh of something that did not care about its own survival as long as it could hurt. Its enemy adrenaline. Kevin gasped, and blood was pouring from his shoulder, and his vision was going gray at the edges, and he said another human thing, and pain becomes fuel. He twisted his body, and he used the creature's own strength against it, and he pulled himself forward, and he slammed his forehead into the creature's face, and his head connected with one of its eyes, and the eye burst. The Void Stalker screamed, and it was a sound of pure shock, and it threw Kevin across the atrium, and he hit the wall hard, and he felt something crack in his chest, but he was still smiling. Kevin got to his feet, and he started walking toward the cargo bay, and the creature followed him. And it was angry now, and it was hurt, and it was not thinking clearly anymore. And that was exactly what Kevin wanted. "Come on," Kevin said, and his voice was barely a whisper, and "come and get me." He led the creature through the last corridor and into the cargo bay, and Brian's voice came through the communicator, and he said, "I am sealing the bay now, and Kevin, you need to get out." Kevin looked at the door, and he looked at the Void Stalker, and he saw that there was no way he could reach the door before the creature reached him, and he made his choice. "Seal it," Kevin said, "and seal it now." Brian hesitated for only a moment, and then the door began to close, and Kevin watched it close, and he watched his only exit disappear, and he turned to face the Void Stalker one last time. The creature lunged, and Kevin dodged, and he kept dodging, and he kept moving, and he led the creature in circles around the cargo bay, and the air was getting thinner, and Kevin could feel himself getting lightheaded, but the creature was getting slower too. Just a little longer, Kevin thought, and just a little longer. The Void Stalker stumbled, and its movements were becoming sluggish, and its eyes were dimming, and Kevin fell to his knees, and he could not breathe properly, and he watched the creature collapse, and he smiled one last time, and then everything went dark. Kevin opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was a ceiling made of white metal, and the second thing he saw was Emily standing over him, and her blue feathers were ruffled with worry, and her golden eyes were wet with what might have been tears. "Is awake," Emily said, and Kevin heard other voices responding, and he heard movement around him, and he realized he was lying on a medical bed, and he realized he was not dead. Kevin tried to sit up, and pain exploded through his body, and he fell back with a groan, and Emily put a feathered hand on his chest, and she said, "Do not move, and you are badly injured." And the medical team said, "You should have died." Kevin laughed, and then he winced because laughing hurt, and he said, "How long was I out?" 3 hours, David said, and the Throssic moved into Kevin's field of vision, and his amphibian face was strange and unreadable. And he said, "Campus security arrived and found you unconscious in the cargo bay, and the Void Stalker was unconscious too, and they contained it before it could wake up." Kevin nodded, and he said, "Good, and is everyone else okay?" Brian answered, and his voice was like stones falling, and he said, "Everyone survived, and no one else was injured, and the creature never made it back to the auditorium." Kevin closed his eyes, and he felt relief wash over him, and the relief was almost as overwhelming as the pain, and he had done it, and he had actually done it, and everyone was alive. The door to the medical room opened, and Kevin heard the sound of many feet entering, and he opened his eyes, and he saw that the room was filling with students, and there were Villani and Throssic and crystallines and dozens of other species, and they were all looking at him, and their expressions were difficult to read. Kevin felt a moment of uncertainty, and he wondered if they were angry with him, and he wondered if they blamed him for what had happened, and he tried to sit up again, and this time David helped him, and Kevin leaned back against the raised portion of the bed, and he looked at the crowd of aliens. No one spoke for a long moment, and the silence stretched, and Kevin did not know what to say. And then a small Villani at the front of the crowd stepped forward, and she was young and her feathers were pale green, and she looked at Kevin with eyes that were wide with something that was not fear. "You saved us," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room, and you could have hidden with the rest of US, and you could have waited for security, and instead you went out there, and you let it hunt you, and you almost died, and you did it for us. Kevin did not know how to respond to that, and he had not really thought about it in those terms, and he had just seen a problem, and he had found a solution, and that solution had involved putting himself in danger. But that was just what humans did. It was not that complicated, Kevin said. And there was a predator, and there were people who needed protection. And I did what anyone would do. David made a sound that might have been a laugh, and he said no, and that is not what anyone would do, and that is what humans do, and there is a difference, and I am beginning to understand that difference. Now the crowd of students murmured in agreement, and Kevin saw that their expressions were not angry, and they were not fearful, and they were something else entirely, and it took him a moment to recognize what he was seeing, and when he did, he felt uncomfortable. They were looking at him with Amelie spoke, and she said, "We watched everything on the security cameras, and we saw you lead the creature through the corridors, and we saw you let it hurt you so that you could hurt it back, and we saw you seal yourself in the cargo bay with it, and we saw you refuse to give up even when you were dying." She paused, and her voice became softer, and she said, "We have stories about creatures like you, and in our stories, they are monsters, and they are things to be feared and avoided, and we never imagined that a monster could also be a protector." Kevin shook his head, and he said, "I am not a monster, and I'm just a human." Brian spoke, and his crystalline voice rang through the room, and he said, "Perhaps that is the same thing, and perhaps that has always been the same thing, and perhaps we were simply too afraid to understand." Door opened again, and Professor Thelix entered, and the insectoid professor had recovered from his molting, and he looked tired and shaken. But he walked with purpose, and he made his way through the crowd of students until he was standing at the foot of Kevin's bed. "I have taught the predator species seminar for 60 years, Professor Thelix said, "and I have shown my students hundreds of dangerous creatures, and I have taught them to fear the things that hunt in the darkness, and I thought I understood what it meant to be a predator." He paused, and his compound eyes studied Kevin, and he said, "I was wrong, and today I learned that there is a difference between a predator and an apex predator, and the difference is not strength or speed or cunning, and the difference is will, and the difference is the refusal to accept defeat, and the willingness to suffer any cost to achieve victory." Kevin did not say anything, and he was not sure there was anything to say. Professor Thelix continued, and he said, "I'm going to redesign my seminar, and I am going to add a new module, and I am going to call it Class 7 Death World Species. And I am going to teach my students why the prey became the predator." The professor turned to address the crowd of students, and he said, "You came here to learn about dangerous creatures, and you have learned that the most dangerous creature in this building was not the one in the cage, and it was the one sitting in the back of my classroom, and it was the one you were all too afraid to talk to." He gestured toward Kevin, and he said, "Humans are what happens when prey animals refuse to be prey, and they are what happens when a species decides that they would rather fight and die than run and live. And they are the answer to the question of what could possibly survive on a world that seems designed to kill everything on it." Emily stepped forward, and she looked at Kevin, and she asked, "Why did you do it? And why did you risk your life for people who have been avoiding you and treating you like a monster?" Kevin thought about the question, and he thought about his answer, and finally he spoke, and he said, "Because that is what humans do, and we protect each other. And when there is danger, we do not run away from the people who need help, and we run toward them, and it does not matter if they are afraid of us, and it does not matter if they do not understand us, and they are still people, and they still needed help." He looked at the crowd of aliens, and he said, "And maybe now you understand, and maybe now you know that you do not have to be afraid of me, and I am not your enemy, and I will never be your enemy, and if something threatens you, then I will stand between you and that something, and I will fight it until one of us stops moving." The room was silent, and then someone started to clap, and it was David and his amphibian. Hands made a wet slapping sound, and then Emily joined in, and her feathered hands made a soft rustling sound, and then Brian joined in, and his crystalline hands made a sound like chimes, and then the whole room was applauding, and Kevin felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. The story spread across the academy, and then across the sector, and then across the galaxy. And it was told and retold, and it grew and changed with each telling, but the core of it remained. The same A creature designed to terrify an entire class had escaped, and it had expected to find easy prey, and instead it had found a human, and the human had made a choice, and the choice was to fight. And in every version of the story, the ending was the same, and it was a photograph of a human, and the human was covered in blood, and the human was barely conscious, and the human was smiling, and across the galaxy species that had never met a human began to understand something that the void stalker had learned too late. Humans were not prey humans, had never been prey humans. Or what happened when prey decided to become something else entirely, and that something else was far more terrifying than any predator the galaxy had ever seen.